Thinking aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Our topic today is biological psychokinesis, or the ability of the human mind to directly influence living biological tissue without the mediation of any known muscular or other mechanical means. Sometimes associated, of course, with psychic healing. My guest today is Marilyn Schlitz, an anthropologist and parapsychology researcher at the Mind Science Foundation of San Antonio, Texas. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you.
You've been very active in psychokinesis research on biological tissues. You've published and written dozens of papers in this area. I think it might be useful to begin with to describe to our viewers how research of this type is conducted, because I know it's very controversial, and I think it's important to impress upon people the care with which you actually do these studies.
Well, I think that the biological psychokinesis work has taken a number of different directions in terms of methodology. Our own work at Mind Science Foundation was initiated by Dr. William Broad at Mind Science. He's a psychologist, an experimental psychologist. And we have worked with a number of different biological systems. We've worked with animals, we've worked with human blood cells. The most abundant topic that we've worked with is the idea of one person influencing another person's physiology without any kind of sensory interaction whatsoever.
You mean like their galvanic skin response or their heartbeat?
Exactly. We're taking various parameters of autonomic nervous system activity, i.e. that part of the nervous system that doesn't require conscious control, and then asking a person. Basically, we bring a person into the laboratory, we sit them down in a comfortable chair, and we monitor some parameter of autonomic activity. Galvanic skin response is the most common form of measurement that we've employed. And what we do basically is we put electrodes on the palms of a person's hand, and this then sends an electrical impulse to a chart recorder and a computer in another room.
It's the same kind of a response that would be measured in a lie detection test.
Exactly.
So, and it's a measure of a person's nervous activity, or sometimes a sweat gland activity in the skin.
That's exactly right. And essentially what we're doing then is asking another person, maybe a healer, maybe just an average person, to come in and influence the distant person's autonomic activity. Okay? So that essentially what we're doing is taking, say, a half-hour period and dividing it up into small sampling epochs. And what we ask the person to do, the healer, is to, at random times throughout the session, either calm or activate the distant person's autonomic activity.
And how distant is the distant person?
Well, we've not manipulated distance to any great degree. Typically we're about 40 yards, something.
In separate rooms?
In separate rooms, separated by several rooms, actually, so that there is no possibility of a sensory interaction between them. Oftentimes the subject, the volunteer who's having their autonomic activity monitored, is in a soundproof room, so that there's no possibility of any kind of sensory information.
The critics would obviously look for this immediately. They'd say, well, there's some kind of cueing going on, that the person knows how to relax themselves or knows how to tense themselves, and they know when the other person is trying to do it, and that's how an artifact would occur.
And that's a very, very good criticism if it were relevant to this particular area of research. In this case, the design that we're using totally precludes any possibility of autonomic self-control as being an explanation for the kind of results we're getting. What we're doing is we're, as I said, dividing up the sampling period. And this, then, there are periods where the healer is trying to influence the autonomic activity, and there are other periods where he's doing nothing but just relaxing and what we call control conditions. So that for any one experimental period, what we're able to do is compare the amount of autonomic nervous system activity during influence periods with those periods when there's no attempt to influence the
In other
distant
words,
activity.
you're asking the healer to arouse the autonomic nervous system.
In some cases, for the majority of experiments that we've done, we've asked the healer to calm the distant activity.
Which would be more of a healing
Exactly.
response. Yeah.
We did one experiment where we looked at a group of needy people who had an exceptionally active autonomic nervous system. And we compared these people with a group of people whose autonomic activity rested in the normal range. And our idea was that if this biological psychokinesis paradigm is relevant to healing, then perhaps those people who had the greatest need to be healed would be more readily influenced. And in fact, that is what we found. There was a significant difference statistically between the two groups, with that group who had the greatest need being more readily influenced than the other group.
So what your research is suggesting then is, at least when we talk about spiritual healing or psychic healing, or the healing touch, things of this sort, or some people being a natural healer, that at least a part of what they are doing as a healer would conform to what parapsychologists call psychokinesis, or mind over matter.
Well, that's basically the hypothesis that we're exploring. I believe that there are a variety of different mechanisms by which healing takes place, and this is true both in medical healing as well as in the context of a variety of non-medical healing practices. For example, I think that there are ethnopharmacological bases to healing. In other words, there are certain magical elixirs that people can prepare, give to a person. They may not know that these ingredients have any known pharmacological basis, but in fact they do have beneficial effects.
Snake oil
would be an example. There are a whole host of them in the pharmacopoeia. And in fact, the American pharmacopoeia, the Pharmacopoeia of the United States of America, is filled with ingredients that were based on Native American remedies and that were then adopted, incorporated into the more pharmacological enterprise. I think so. You've got drugs and you've got physical manipulation as one possible mechanism. Then you've got a whole host of sort of psychosomatic mechanisms.
The power of suggestion.
One area of research that's gaining popularity today is what's, for a 50-cent word if you want it, is psychoneuroimmunology. And basically the idea here is that emotional states, psychological states, can influence our body's immune system, our natural ability to fight disease. And we have known for quite a while that negative emotions, stress for example, has a detrimental effect on the immune system, reduces our body's ability to fight illness. What's more controversial at this point is whether or not positive emotions, laughter, guided imagery, for example, can have a beneficial effect on the body's immune system. And there are a number of studies going on in different laboratories in the United States right now looking at the impact of sort of positive emotions. At Mind Science, for example, we're looking at the impact of guided imagery on women's ability to fight breast cancer. We have three groups. We have women with malignant tumors who are undergoing conventional cancer therapy, radiation, chemotherapy. We have a group of women who have tumors but which are benign, that have no pathological significance. And then we have a third group who have no known physical malady at all. And what we're doing is looking at a whole host of different immune competence measurements to see if, in fact, guided imagery, for example, a person imagining that their white blood cells are knights on horses coming out and killing the cancer cells, whatever kind of imagery best works for the individual. We're trying to see whether, in fact, this does have a beneficial impact on the immune system. It's a very difficult, complicated area of research, and I think it will be some time before we have any definite conclusions. then finally I would say that ESP, and psychokinesis may have a role to play in the healing process. And I think that, for example, you can think about extrasensory perception, a more information type of paradigm.
It's sort of the passive side of psychokinesis.
Yes, in a sense you can think about it that way. There are ways in which a healer, for example, may diagnose a person without any kind of sort of modern technology, but in fact come up with very accurate diagnostic conclusions about the person's problem. So that may be a form of clairvoyance. They may be somehow reading a person's body for signs that aren't available at the sensory level. Another area in which psi might enter the healing process is through prescriptive means. In other words, somehow, and this might fit with the ethnopharmacology work, is that a healer somehow ascertains the person's problem and then, without any kind of medical knowledge, somehow decides what the person needs to do to solve this problem.
In your own work, in your research, or the research that you're aware of more or less directly, what are the strongest kinds of effects that you've encountered in which psi abilities seem to affect the healing process?
Well, I think for the most part the work we're doing in the laboratory isn't healing per se, but rather can be thought of as a model for healing. And I think that our own biological psychokinesis work, this work with the electrodermal activity, the galvanic skin response, it has been highly successful.
In other words, they're very strong effects.
Well, we're not getting so much a strong effect within a given experimental trial. But what we are finding is that across the 14 formal laboratory experiments that we've done to date, that we have a highly significant, statistically
Consistency of the effect. Then.
Right. Across, in other words, the difference between those periods when the healer's trying to influence the autonomic activity and those periods where they're not are very different.
I suppose that kind of research, though, suggests that if the intentions of the person transmitting the psychokinesis were not beneficial as a healer's would be, they could be used for harmful purposes, to interfere, to induce stress rather than to relieve stress.
Well, certainly there are several things one could say about that. You know, feeding the popular paranoia, we might note that many people visiting the Soviet Union have observed that, in fact, that is their main interest in doing the biological psychokinesis research, which they are doing, some work in, is in fact for sort of negative purposes. The same could be said for our own work. One of the things that we've attempted to do to get around that criticism is to look at some possibility of screening ourselves from this kind of effect and blocking the effect, as it were. And so what we asked people to do in one experiment was to come in and visualize a protective screen around themselves. They could use whatever kind of psychological technique they wanted to, but there was no physical screen around them.
Right.
And we then compared those people with a second group who were asked to be open and responsive to the effect. And in fact, while the result wasn't totally unambiguous, the trend was that that group that was attempting to block had less influence than that group that was being open and responsive.
Well, that's very interesting. Psychic shielding.
I think it's important because if people are having psychic experiences, one important thing is to know that we can control it rather than that it simply controls us.
Fascinating, fascinating. So how about in the area of psychic diagnosis? Have there been good research studies?
There have not been a lot of research studies. My own work, I'm much more familiar with the experimental work that's been done, and in the area of diagnostics, there's been very, very little work, really.
I recall a book written by Shafia Karagula, who is a psychiatrist in Los Angeles, in which she describes some case studies with some subjects she worked with who went to a hospital and diagnosed patients in a clinic there and saw auras and began describing tumors and things in great detail, which were later verified by physicians. But this was a clinical study rather than an experimental study, so I suppose the methods weren't quite as rigorous.
Well, one of the difficulties, I certainly wouldn't criticize sort of that clinical approach in any way. One of the difficulties in working in a real life setting, as though being in a laboratory isn't real life, it clearly is, but being in a natural setting, you can't control the variables in the same way you can within the laboratory. And so trying to understand exactly what's happening is very difficult.
The biofeedback, or the term, one of the terms that's used in your laboratory, which I found quite extraordinary, was called allobiofeedback, in which the person, as I understand it, the person transmitting the psychokinesis is receiving biofeedback, but not from their own body, from the body of the person whom they're trying to influence.
Exactly. The person whose autonomic activity we're monitoring is sent to a chart recorder so that the healer or the influencer is getting feedback about how well they're doing based on the autonomic response registered on the chart recorder. So that, yes, that's exactly right. In a sense, rather than influencing your own activity, many of the healers employ a strategy where what they're doing is bringing about the desired effect in themselves and then hoping that sympathetically it will transfer to the distant person.
Well, you've written, Marilyn, about the phenomenology that takes place in people who do healing work, and I think it's useful to talk about what are the best states of mind, the best internal strategies that seem to facilitate. If I wanted to become a healer myself, what kind of advice would you give me?
Well, I think that the first thing I'd say is to make generalizations is always very dangerous. I think that there are a variety of different techniques and different idiosyncratic methods for different people. In our own laboratory, we've seen that there are probably 3 primary strategies that people employ for bringing about this bio-PK kind of effect. And again, I'm separating that from healing per se, because it really is a different kind of framework. But one is, as I just mentioned, trying to influence yourself with the idea that this effect would transfer to the distant person. Another idea is to actually physically manipulate the distant person without any kind of sensory interaction, so that what you're doing is, instead of influencing yourself, you are mentally trying to influence the distant person.
I might imagine in my mind that I was giving them a massage or something of that sort.
Right, exactly, and inducing in them the desired response. And then the third strategy is to actually influence the machinery, so that for those people who use that kind of strategy,
don't worry about the person, let's just affect the strip chart recorder.
And that's one of the things that happens, and that's really why I'm separating the bio-PK from healing per se. Although I think it's very important in terms of its potential implications for the healing process.
This kind of work in bio-PK suggests to me that we may be doing this to each other all the time. If I have an angry thought about another person, or if I sometimes feel someone else having an angry thought towards me, that may be an example of bio-PK, or a loving thought.
Yeah, one of the things we need to be careful of is that we don't sort of drown ourselves in paranoia, because certainly we hear many instances of people who are concerned that someone is influencing their own physiology. And in cases like that, my clearest message to those people is drawn from the blocking studies, and that yes, in fact, it is possible to shield yourself from these kind of effects. One of the other things we know from the parapsychological literature is what's called the sheep-goat effect. And in other words, those sheep are those people who believe that psychic phenomena are real. Goats are those people who are very resistant to that. And what we see is that those people in the bio-PK design, for example, what is very possible is that if you believe somebody can influence you, then you are much more likely to be influenced. So that when somebody is complaining that they feel that somebody's influencing their physiology in a real life setting, in circumstances that they're not happy about, I simply tell them, don't give that person the power over you. You know, maintain your own self. essentially.
And the people who are the transmitters or the influencers or the healers in these studies, are they drawn across a wide spectrum of the population, or are you looking for talented healers to begin with?
Well, we have worked with both. I mean, we have worked with selected subjects, such as Matthew Manning, for example.
The British psychic, who's
That's right,
very
a
famous,
healer,
yes.
who did very well in the laboratory. We have worked with a variety of what we call unselected subjects, people who are simply interested in working in the psychic healing area. The majority of the experiments we've done have been with ourselves, the experimenters, as the influencers. And one could argue that in a sense we're special subjects, and certainly we are the most motivated people to see an experiment work out because it's our experiment. So.
Now, I know in general that your laboratory has a history of a lot of successful results, and yet, and you're confident that you're getting good data, and yet I know you've been quoted in Omni magazine as describing psychic research as being equivalent to trying to capture butterflies in a dark room. It might be useful to talk a little bit about the nature of psi, its elusive nature, or what it's like working with this phenomenon.
Well, it's very challenging is what it is. I mean, you find that we have, in the laboratory, produced a fairly reliable effect, but whether or not, whenever we approach an experiment, one can psych themselves up and give themselves the highest expectation for success, but we're still never totally sure we're going to be able to capture it within the laboratory setting. So that working in parapsychology, working in this area of biological psychokinesis, or any area of ESP research, it can be a very frustrating endeavor. On the other hand, it's incredibly challenging, and I think that that's the thing that motivates many researchers to keep going, is to understand this elusive property.
How do you think that the scientific community at large is responding to your research?
Well, I think that there's a lot of resistance, and I think there's a lot of skepticism. I think many people don't bother to read the formal laboratory reports and instead simply approach the issue with a preconceived expectation that the stuff simply can't work that way. You know, there must be something wrong with our methodology. Somehow, something happened that allowed a sensory interaction between these two systems. We have really knocked ourselves out to make sure that that isn't the explanation. Certainly one of the things that happens, I know many physicians who employ the aid of psychics, both for diagnostic purposes and actually for physical manipulation. And one of the things that they are very clear to do is make sure that that doesn't get around to a lot of people, because there is a social control over healthcare, and the dominant medical establishment controls the way that the human body is manipulated and conceptualized. And I think that the psychic healing work is a direct threat to that sort of domination of the human body.
Well, let me get back once more to the issue of scientific acceptance. I know from my experience, and I think you would agree, that the harshest, or not the harshest, the most rigorous critics of parapsychology research are other parapsychologists. And I wonder how the parapsychology community, and there are perhaps a dozen other laboratories doing research of this type, how have these people responded to your studies?
Our work has been very well accepted. I mean, we have presented papers at a variety of different technical conferences, and I believe that we have published enough careful laboratory reports that people can critique our methodology. It's no longer a matter of simply taking our word for it. They can go through the laboratory reports, they can critique our data if they want. It's available for people. One thing that we would really like to see is other laboratories replicate our results, because we have, as I mentioned, done 14 formal experiments looking at this GSR activity. But we really need other independent laboratories to take it up. There have been several sort of conceptual replications of the work, but nothing directly replicating it. And it's very important in science to have replication.
I can see, Marilyn, that being in this field it confronts you probably with the most penetrating, stimulating challenge that anybody in science might want to take on. How has it affected you as a person in your own growth to be working in the healing area? Has it affected you more than just scientifically?
Well, I think that my reason for wanting to do this kind of work, the healing work, within the larger framework of parapsychology, is that it is the most clearly applicable area of parapsychology. So that it certainly gives one more motivation to do the research, and it makes it a little easier to handle the frustrations when you know that there's a real potential payoff at the end. In terms of my own sort of personal development, I think that the challenges that are faced by our attempts to capture this elusive butterfly in the laboratory sort of reflect a challenge to face any kind of unknown. And I think that one can only hope that they do it with a good degree of rigor and care.
Have you used yourself as a subject in the healing work?
Well, yes, we have done a lot of work with ourselves as the influencers, and actually have a real high rate of success for ourselves. We as the experimenters overall have a higher performance rate than the unselected person just coming in off the streets. But that makes sense. We're much more familiar with the methodology and comfortable with the surroundings.
And I guess then your goal as researchers is, at least to some extent, to develop both an objective and a subjective understanding of psi phenomena.
Absolutely. I think that one of the most important things is to map the consciousness of our participants, in all areas of the human potential. And certainly in healing, one of the things we see is that an individual's conceptualization of illness may or may not correspond to the healer's conceptualization, and that one of the things we need to do is be able to map those two things onto each other, because certainly in the realm of the psychosomatic, it's very important that there be good communication between healer and healee.
Well, you seem to be expressing, Marilyn, in your research and in your own life, more and more of a sensitivity to these subtle issues that do affect the healing, not only from a psi perspective, but in terms of, as you have pointed out, the psychosomatic aspects of it, the physical aspects, and the immunological aspects of healing.
Well, one of the things science does is forces you to compartmentalize, so that when you think about mechanisms of healing, you're looking at the different subtle elements and how we can separate those out.
Marilyn, we're out of time. I'm going to have to cut you off now, but thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for being with us.